Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third British Zeitgeist video. This is a pretty short period of time. We are thinking about Henrician England, which is the time that Henry VIII was on the throne. And why do I set this apart as its own time? It's kind of this transitional moment that I think is really interesting and has a lot in common with, but also a lot that's different between what came before and what came after. So I think it is worth stopping and thinking about this period just a little bit as its own moment before we move on. So this period is often referred to as the Renaissance, which you've probably heard before, right? What is a Renaissance? How does it impact England? That's what I want us to think about first, right? So a Renaissance is usually thought of as this rebirth of classical learning and knowledge and ideas. And this began in Italy in the 14th century with Dante and Petrarch and Leonardo da Vinci and all of these kinds of guys, right? This moves through the artwork of Michelangelo and all of these other artists in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. And this continues up through Northern Europe and England, all the way through the age of Shakespeare and Marlowe, but we'll get to that in the next video. And lots of people, though, myself included, we really challenge this idea of a Renaissance because it implies that what went before is somehow like less important or less educated, or that these ideas that were circulating during this time period were suddenly like new and brand new discovered. And that really isn't true, right? But there's even periods earlier than this that people refer to as the Renaissance. So, and there's certainly periods after this that people call that. So it's just a narrative that a lot of people use, but I think it is important to know that the courts of Europe, absolutely no doubt, are competing with each other to have the finest minds, the greatest art, all of these kinds of things. And so it's worth thinking about this period in that way for that reason, if for nothing else. So what about good old jolly old Henry VIII over here? Let's talk about him for a second. He reigned in England from 1509 to 1547. And he's usually like thought of as that guy who got married 6 times. You may have heard he had 6 wives, right? Divorced, executed, died, divorced, executed, survived is the kind of the little litany that people say about his wives. But he did more than just get married and grow fat. He actually started out as a really like svelte, good looking guy, but he gave in to his diets and his power and eventually just died like morbidly obese, right? So in his early years, he was known for cultivating both his mind and his body. He did all kinds of great sports. He was really intellectual. And he brought some of the greatest scholars of his age to England. He worked just as hard as all the other courts in continental Europe to be the greatest and the best. That was something that was very important to him. He took being a king kind of to the next level compared to what anybody else had done. Like when you think about a king or a queen of England, you will often think about them being referred to as Your Majesty. Henry VIII started that tradition. Before that, it was perfectly fine to address a monarch as Your Grace or Your Highness or something like that, right? But not Your Majesty. That was definitely Henry VIII's innovation because he really wanted everyone to think of him that way. And this is an indication of all the major issues that he had, right? I'm going to give you a great quote from historian Kenneth Morgan. Henry VIII's egoism, self-righteousness, and unlimited capacity to brood over suspected wrongs or petty slights sprang from the fatal combination of a relatively able but distinctly second-rate mind and a profound inferiority complex that derived from Henry VII's treatment of his second son. Yeah, it's kind of a harsh quote, but might be kind of on the money there. So keep in mind that Henry VIII was the second son, because that's going to be important as we think about this, this period in a little bit more time. So here we go. Let's think a little bit more about humanism and learning. So these 4 images that I'm looking at with us here, we have Leonardo da Vinci's very famous illustration of man here. We have an image of the printing press. We have the opening page from Thomas More's Utopia, and this famous dude here is a good old Desiderius Erasmus. I can never say that right the first time. So humanism is a major force of knowledge at this time. And this was thought of as, quote, the new learning. Like this is how they thought of themselves, humanists. And this is very much a a Christian way of thinking about knowledge. Scholars at this time period were really interested in learning the Greek language, not just Latin, not just to read Plato and Homer and Virgil and Ovid and Aristotle and all these kinds of things, but also to read the New Testament, the Christian Bible, in its original language. Plato's philosophy of ideal forms, you've probably encountered this at some point. This is a key concept, the idea that like every object on earth and every idea has this sort of like ideal abstract form that is actually in its own way more real than any like actual real manifestation that exists in the world. So this is a way of thinking about like the world that is radically different, which is that everything is striving towards its ideal self, its perfect form, but that form can't actually exist on Earth, right? So the study of Greek and Latin at this time period had a huge influence on the way that the English language is changing during this period as well. This classical aesthetic of like really long, balanced sentences is finding its way into English at this point, and so language gets a little bit more cumbersome, I would say, but like it's definitely a lot more educated and seems more polished to the people writing it. But if you have ever struggled with a long and complex sentence, you can thank or bemoan Henrician England, I guess, for that, for humanist scholars. So here, let's think a little bit about the way literature and culture is working during this time period. And we're going to look at this printing press image for part of that. This is really the time period where we see the beginning of what scholars refer to as print culture, right? The printing press is invented by Gutenberg in the 1450s. And books are printed in England at first in 1476 by William Caxton, who owns the first printing press in England. And I know we've already talked about that in class. But this allows books to be produced more quickly and to provide greater access to reading materials for a broader spectrum of the population. Humanists and Protestants, we'll get to Protestants in a minute, but lots of people at this time period are really working to expand literacy. They want to have more people actively reading and learning for themselves. And so we get a lot of genres that are getting increasingly popular at this time: prose fiction, poetry, travel narratives, religious writing, political writing. All of these are kind of taking off, and more people are reading them and thinking about them. So in terms of the economics of the period, let's look a little bit at this map of London here. This is a great map of London to look at. We're moving, as we have talked about before, into much more of an economy and a society that is focused on cities as well as rural life. So we're very much at this time period in an economy that is based on money, on hard cash, because this is becoming the norm because more and more people are moving to cities. And so you don't have that relationship with your neighbor that you do, well, hey, I'll trade you some chickens for, some bread or some veggies or whatever, and where everybody can kind of get along in a barter economy, which I'm sad about. I really wish that we still operated in a barter economy a lot of the time. I think that would be more fair in many ways. But London as a city is on its way to becoming Europe's largest city. We have around 50,000 people living in London at this time. That doesn't sound like a lot, like even here in Frederick, which is a fairly small city, we are larger than London was in Henrician England. It was around 50,000 at the time that Henry VIII took the throne. And the other cities in England were much smaller. There were only 5 cities in England at the time that had 10,000 people or more than that. But there are lots of little towns that are growing up as well. Cities and towns are places of opportunity. There's greater literacy there. There's a greater variety of types of work, but it's still not like the safest or cleanest place. We have a lower life expectancy in the cities than we do in the country, simply because there's some poor hygiene conditions. And, we actually do have violent crime in cities back then, just like we do now. So one of those things that is also a big part of this money economy has nothing to do with cities, though, and it's these sheep. We get a nice long discussion about sheep devouring England in More's Utopia, as we're going to read. And so we have this idea that like large sections of what used to be farmlands are now being controlled by wealthy people and enclosed to not grow sheep, but to pasture sheep, right? To put sheep out for pasture. So More tells us that sheep are devouring men because lands that have formerly been used for growing food and farming are now being transformed into these pastures for sheep because wool is a valuable export, and rich people get richer off the sale of wool than they do growing food to feed people. So this is a big change as we are shifting into this very money-based economy in England at the time. We are also dealing right now with the beginnings of the English Reformation. So we're going to think about that. Certainly by this time period, by the 16th century, the Catholic Church was unequaled in power and wealth and influence throughout Europe in terms of an institution. There's nothing to equal it. The church was just a massive political and economic force to be reckoned with. And so it's not just this religious hierarchy, but it's also this societal force. And so as is often the case, money and power breed corruption, right? So this is a byproduct of what's going on in the church. This is not the first time in the history of the church that people are looking to reform the Catholic Church. One of the biggest calls to reform prior to this time period actually did come from England, a man named John Wycliffe and the followers that he had. They were put down as heretics at the time, but certainly a lot of what they had to say is echoed in people like Martin Luther and John Calvin, who we see happening during this time. So the beginning of the Reformation, as we kind of see commemorated in this bottom image here, is often pinpointed as this moment when Martin Luther gets frustrated by the sale of indulgences, which is basically like you can pay to be absolved of your sins, right? And he gets very cranky, and he goes and he nails his 95 theses for reforming the church to the door of the church in Wittenberg. And this is the thing that most people think about as the beginning of the Reformation. But and we do get a reformed Protestants, non-Catholic church in England at this time during the reign of Henry VIII, but actual reform doesn't come to England until after Henry is gone. The start of the English Reformation has less to do with faith or reform and doctrine than it does Henry's ego and his personal life. So the quick version of all of this is that Henry, as I mentioned earlier, was actually Henry VII's second son. His older brother, Arthur, was originally planned to be the king after his dad. And so Arthur was married to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. And just a few months later, he died. And so because Henry VII wanted to maintain this relationship, this connection, this alliance with Spain, he said, okay, hey, Pope, can you help me out? Because like my kid Arthur was married to Catherine, and I'd really like for my younger son, Henry, to marry her now. Does that work for you? And the Pope said, yeah, sure, okay. And so this is normally not allowed, but money, corruption, as already pointed out, these things happen. And so when Henry VIII decides that he's really upset that he doesn't have a son, and he's also fallen in love with someone else, this person right here, Anne Boleyn, we're going to put her right in the middle. He suddenly gets a conscience, and he's like, oh, Catherine was my brother's widow, and I really shouldn't be married to her. And that's why we haven't had a son. But honestly, it really was just that he fell in love with Anne Boleyn, and he really wanted a kid, a male child, a son. And so he gets a divorce. So the Pope is not okay with this. He says, no, you can't do this. This is really not okay. I went through all this to get, you married to this lady, and it's not going to be okay. And so Henry VIII just eventually stopped asking and said, okay, well, basically, see ya, Pope, I'm going to start my own church. And so he separates England from the Catholic Church so that he can get a divorce without the Pope approving it, and makes himself the sovereign of England. He says, I am now also the head of the Church of England, and this happens in 1534. He changes very little about the operation of the church. The doctrines and practices of the new church are basically still like Catholic Church, except that the Bible is now available in English as is worship. In order for Henry to get his divorce from Catherine, he needed Protestants on his side, and he was basically like, I'm okay with church being in English if I can get what I want. So he got the Protestants on his side and managed to get what he wanted. And so he saw this as a win-win. A lot of people, though, weren't actually excited about turning their back on the church that they had grown up in, and their parents had grown up in, and all of their traditions were part of. And so Henry VIII, required all adult males to swear an oath affirming that Henry VIII is now to be recognized as the supreme head of the Church of England. Most men did because they wanted to continue going on about their lives, and they may have been upset about it in private, but they kind of went about just kind of playing nice with Henry in public. But some people, like Thomas More, who was Henry VIII's chancellor, his chief lawyer, didn't. And so we will talk more about Thomas More when we read his book. But he was executed because he refused to swear the oath and wanted to stay Catholic. So because I'm about to start coughing, here's the end of our video. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in class next week. Bye.